Some people don't understand why many of us have concerns about the present pontificate. It's a weird concept to them, many thinking that the Pope can do no wrong, that he is a luminous being of some kind, chosen personally by the Holy Spirit. Really weird stuff that has no roots in Catholic thinking at all. To help understand with all of that, I have a story for you and a letter that sums up much of what our position is on that, written by a layman residing in Rome, who sees all of this firsthand. As we dive into this, keep the following in mind if you can. Pope Pius XII's words on the nature of the faith and its relationship with our changing times is something to keep in mind when we discuss why the faithful have, shall we say, issues with the present pontificate. Here are Pius XII's words, quote, "The doctrine of the faith that God has revealed has not been proposed as a philosophical discovery to be perfected by human ingenuity, but given to the Church of Christ as a divine deposit to be faithfully kept and infallibly proclaimed." He said those words long ago, but they are just as relevant today. Bear this in mind as we discuss this bit of news involving Francis, and then ponder this as I present to you an open letter from an Italian figure who expounds exactly why we, as traditionally minded Catholics, have such issues with Francis. To set the stage for this, if you need proof that whatever Francis is doing is at the least making the way for the ape of the Church, if not building it up directly himself, let's have a look. Francis will be speaking at Pastor Jimmy Martin's annual bridge building party, the LAREC. If you don't like acronyms like that, the LAREC is the Los Angeles Religious Education Conference, which is the annual shindig in Los Angeles that is the biggest party of modernism in North America, complete with awful modern music and strange teaching that doesn't have anything to do with Catholicism. It has the stamp of approval from Bishop Barron, who usually addresses the conference. From the Los Angeles Archdiocesan Office for Religious Ed, Sister Rosalia Meza, who is that office's senior director, described Francis's participation as a quote-unquote great blessing. She goes further. From Michael Hitchborn's outlet, we go to this one. Quote, "The conference, be it virtual this year, is a time of encounter, a time to gather to celebrate and grow in our faith, bringing us closer to Christ and God's loving mercy, but most importantly, to take what we learned during these days and take it back to our community," stated Sister Meza. The Pope will deliver his address on the first day of the event. The conference, which this year is held under the theme of Proclaim the Promise, has a history of hosting speakers who work against what the Catholic Church teaches on major issues, and mostly quote. Those issues are, to paraphrase the article with the language I typically employ, those issues are usually on matters pertaining to Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church's bridge building campaign. And speaking of Pastor Jimmy, he'll of course be one of the keynote speakers this year because, again, of course he will. Which brings me to this. A letter was written to the public on Marco Tossati's blog. Tossati is a journalist based out of Rome who covers things from an authentically Catholic perspective. He usually gets veganos letters that others don't get, many of which I've covered for you without anyone else even mentioning them. The letter from a layman that he published is about why we take issue with the current pontificate, at least for those who accept Francis as Pope. It's an interesting letter. It follows. Let me know if it resonates with you. I translated it using Google, so I had to clean it up a bit. Without further ado. The question of the pontificate of Pope Bergoglio, of his ability to move in ambiguity, is an occasion for reflection for the Christian and beyond. In recent times, the question of una cum has arisen, or union with, an expression quoted by the priest a few moments after the consecration, together with your servant, Pope Francis. For many observers, the mention is not legitimate due to the heterodox positions of the pontiff. Reflection, however, is another. It is not about whether in union with is legitimate or not, although the question makes sense. The point that observers raise is that Francis has a two-faced Janus position, oscillating between the Church of Christ and what Malachi Martin called the superforce. The reference is to the superforce that belongs to the members of the Vatican hierarchy, authors of the ideological cultural thrust. This is the circle that would influence Pope Francis and that would aim to deconstruct the Church in the name of the beast. It will be said, the pontiff represents the rock of the Church of Christ and is untouchable. It will be said again, Bergoglio is still a man and is, as such, is subject to weakness, as evident from the request for prayers he asks for at the end of every public speech. Yet how do you keep quiet in the face of the evidence? We're talking about Pachamama, the idol of the Mother Earth of the Amazon, received with the great fanfare in the Vatican. Of the non-determination to defend the family on all fronts, one above all the non-support for the big meeting of families held in Verona from 29th through to the 31st of March 2019, the slowness with which he moved in addressing the Cardinal Theodore McCarrick issue, his role in ignoring Cardinal Zen and his requests related to that cardinal's home, and the way that the laity have been treated there, and to allow the ministers of the church to be chosen by those outside the church in that place, albeit in concurrence with the Vatican. The same doctrine has become with the modernists. The reference is to the post-synodal apostolic exhortation of Amoris Laetitia. If at most AL is in tune with the times and therefore sheds light on the reality with regard to nuptial situations, it is also necessary to contemplate that the papal document generates confusion and uncertainties widespread in the Church, since Francis, being a Jesuit, advances interpretations set from below to reach the top, and in this is helped by the quote-unquote enlarged circle present in the various forms, and not starting from the top to shed light on the bottom. But how is it possible that the Argentinian Pope does not realize that the Church of Christ is not the one conceived in its rooms, where one is nourished by modernist wisdom and spirituality, but is the one in which Peter's boat is drifting, leaking everywhere, with priests, not all for charity, perched and in difficulty in relating to the Christian people, priests with an air of arrogance and surliness that make the faithful move away from the Church, putting them even more in a hard situation. How can we remain silent if we consider that Bergoglio looks at the thought of Leviathan, supports the demiurges of the superforce, whose ideas have nothing to do with the truths of Christ? How can you stay silent and not affirm the no to the modernist who works for the establishment of the infrastructure of the beast, the ape of the church that has become as making the church a secular institution? If Jesus Christ is physically present today walking among us, he would have overturned the tables and driven out the sellers of these ideas, as the gospel teaches. Pope Francis, 2 lines of heartfelt appeal. Stop this drift. Be courageous to clean up the bad ideas within you. Those bad ideas whose purpose is to change the connotations of the family with St. Joseph, representative of fatherhood, which no longer exists because of the pressure from Caesar that you have endorsed. Other than the year dedicated to St. Joseph, which you did as a joke, His Holiness, the prayers of the faithful will become more heartfelt and widespread. Union with, therefore, is the sun of this perimeter of judgments. It is clear to everyone that in the Eucharist only Christ is the center of gravity, regardless of the goodness of the Pope or the duty of the celebrating minister. Just as in the sacrament of confession, whose absolution is not invalidated if it were imparted by a priest in a state of serious acts against the Church. It is Christ who gives absolution. The priest is only an intermediary. The question of the union with the Pope is dystopian. It creates division and would play the game of darkness. Whether the question of union with is legitimate or not, it does not invalidate the Eucharist at all. The faithful must therefore go to Mass, participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice, regardless of the questions. At stake is the growth of faith that needs unity, humility, balance to be anchored to the faith of Christ. If anything, instead of fighting Bergoglio from positions of strength, the witnesses of evangelizers of the culture should find a place in churches and civil society that would help the Church. If we admit that Bergoglio took Christ's Church adrift, it would be natural to affirm that if reality were so, then it should be agreed that the Father of life permits it, for a greater good of the Church that will come, for the benefit of the rest of the evangelical memory, that remnant that yearns for in a different church from the one drawn by the current pontiff. I believe that dissent or discontent can, on a concrete level, be pursued, as mentioned, through the evangelization of the culture. Those restorers who, under the actions of the Holy Spirit, restore the revealed truths and commandments of Christ, provided that the evangelization of culture is supported by prayer and that the fruit of grace is made in meetings, debates, conferences, publications, witnesses, and charity. Pope Paul VI, on the occasion of the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul on June 29, 1972, pronounced the famous expression that the smoke of Satan had entered the Church, that the situation therefore comes from inside the Church. St. Pius X, Pope Giuseppe Melchior Sarto, the greatest pope of the 20th century, was illuminating in this regard. He said, quote, "Be strong, we must not give in. We must fight not with half-term, but with courage, not in secret, but in public, not behind closed doors, but in the open." Pope Sarto also affirmed that a priest who is not a saint is not only useless, but is harmful to the Church. Regarding peace, he said, once the divinity is denied, it is absurdly invoked. Where God is absent, justice is exiled. And once that happens, the Pope of Peace is nourished in vain. The castle, therefore, of the superforce, of the fraternity of modernism, of the Church transformed into an agency which partners with the beast infrastructure, will fall by itself. The ape of the Church will crumble. Satan's smoke will clear and disappear, because in the end, the Immaculate Heart of Mary will win. Signed, Vitantonio Matasculo. And there you have it. Francis will be appearing at the Los Angeles Religious Ed Conference, which should be a note of concern for the faithful. For those who are awake to things, it will be. Many will probably sleepwalk through it, though. Now, what do you think of this letter? Especially in light of all that. Let me know in the comments, please. As always, pray for the Church. Thank you for listening. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.